Welcome to the Deep Dive. We're here to cut through the noise on some pretty complex global issues. Today, we're really digging into the world of global trade, specifically that evolving dynamic between the European Union and the United States. And it's quite a fascinating look at how these big economic shifts can, empower some players or maybe limit others. And for this deep dive, our insights are drawn from an economist's detailed take from a YouTube transcript, actually. It gives us this really unique window into predictions, market reactions, inflation worries, and that whole strategic dance of international talks.
That's right. And our mission really is to unpack what's happening right now, economically, and what might be coming just down the road. We want to explore the strategies from both the EU and the US side, and importantly, uncover some of those, let's say, hidden pressures that could shape future deals. So you get a really solid grasp on it all.
Okay, so let's kick things off with a pretty big prediction from our source. The Economist expects significant inflation hitting American consumers soon, like in the next 1 to 2 months. What are the indicators? What are we actually seeing that points towards this?
Well, what's really striking is that we're already seeing some movement here. Goods that have those higher tariffs, the taxes on imports, basically, especially things coming in heavily from China, well, they've already seen bigger price jumps in the last month or so. Think about stuff like clothes, consumer electronics, audio, visual bits and pieces. But, and this is important, the price increases we've seen so far, they aren't actually proportional yet to the size of the tariffs, which suggests, there's probably more impacts still waiting in the wings for the U.S. economy.
Right, that delayed impact is key. Now, here's where it gets particularly interesting when you think about Europe. The Economist suggests Europe might have signed on to deals where, well, America clearly gets the better end of the stick. But the thinking is, maybe if Europe had just held off a few months, waited for America to feel that inflation bite, perhaps the negotiating leverage could have shifted. So why didn't they? Is there a strategy? Or are there pressures forcing their hand?
That really hits on a crucial point about timing and, well, the realities of negotiation. From the European side, there's actually a strong signal that this isn't, the final word. Ursula von der Leyen, for example, she explicitly called it the beginning of an agreement. And importantly, not yet legally binding. She framed it as a starting point for a negotiation.
Okay, so the door is still open then.
Exactly. That language really implies Europe sees room to maneuver. And maybe, just as The Economist suggests, they are trying to wait for conditions to improve. But, there could also be pressures pushing, needing some stability now, maybe specific industries lobbying for something concrete sooner rather than later.
Okay, so if Europe is potentially playing a longer game here, strategically waiting, how might these rising economic pressures, like inflation, actually affect America's position when they come back to the table? Does it weaken their hand?
Well, if you connect the dots, yes, significant inflation in the U.S. could definitely squeeze the American government. If prices really take off, the Federal Reserve, that's the U.S. central bank, becomes much less likely to cut interest rates.
Right.
And that tends to push up government bond yields. Basically, it gets more expensive for the U.S. government to borrow money. And when borrowing costs rise like that, it puts real pressure on the government. It could be a point where they feel they need to roll back some policies, as the source puts it. Definitely a strategic vulnerability to watch, a potential pain point.
So how's Wall Street taking all this? How are the markets reading the situation? Are they nervous about this pressure, or are they still feeling optimistic?
It's actually quite hard to pin down a single market view right now. Different markets seem to be focusing on different outcomes. There are sort of two main scenarios floating around where the tariff damage might end up being limited for the U.S. One is basically that, well, the tariffs just won't have that big an effect on inflation or growth in the end. Maybe the economy absorbs it.
Okay.
The other is kind of the famous Trump always chickens out theory, though it applies more broadly now. It's the idea that eventually politicians will just roll back the tariffs or soften the policies when the pressure mounts. A pragmatic adjustment.
Right, a course correction.
Exactly. So markets are essentially weighing up those possibilities. Either the impact is manageable or policy will shift before it gets too bad.
Okay, so given all these moving parts, the inflation risk, the potential shift in leverage, The Economist strongly advises Europe, take your time fleshing out this deal. Wait until the second half of the year when the tariff impact really hits the U.S. The timing seems like it could favor Europe. But is the tide really turning for them? You mentioned pressures. What's actually holding Europe back from fully seizing this potential advantage?
Yeah, while the timing might look good on paper, our source points to a really significant internal hurdle for the EU. It's described as a coordination problem.
Coordination problem.
hmm Basically, the different member states within the EU often just don't agree on what they want out of these big negotiations. They tend to focus on protecting their own specific national interests.
Okay. Internal divisions.
Precisely. And this internal friction, apparently in this specific negotiation, meant Europe ended up with a very limited negotiating position. Their lack of unity effectively weakened their hand on the global stage. And it gets even more complex when you look at trade balances.
That's a perfect segue, actually. There's a common idea, maybe misconception, about EU-US trade. A lot of people probably assume the U.S. imports way more stuff from Europe than it sends back the other way. Is that true?
No, not for Europe as a whole block, interestingly enough. Europe overall actually exports more goods to the US than the US exports to Europe.
Really? Okay.
But, and this is key, it's different when you zoom in on individual countries. Take the Netherlands, for instance. They specifically import more from the US than they export to them. It's an important distinction, and it underlines why countries like the Netherlands can't just go off and sign their own trade deals with the US. Because they're part of the Eurozone, trade policy is largely handled at the EU level. Which brings us right back to those differing national interests and that internal coordination problem we were just talking about. It makes things complicated.
So let's try to wrap this up. What does this all mean for you listening? We've seen how this predicted U.S. inflation could, potentially, shift the power dynamic in trade talks. We've looked at how Europe seems to be playing for time, strategically, but is hampered by those internal coordination issues. And we touched on the different ways the markets are trying to guess what happens next.
Right. And all this raises, I think, a really important question for you to ponder. If Europe's coordination problem, its internal divisions, really did limit its negotiating power in this instance,
Yeah.
what does that suggest about its ability to navigate the, frankly, very complex and often messy world of global trade going forward? How much does that internal unity or lack thereof truly dictate a major economic bloc's power and influence on the world stage? It's something worth thinking about.